braving this data point morning. We have a very nice panel coming up here, Becoming Data Point, which is going to be introduced in detail by Jussi Parikka. What we will, I think, be discussing is not only this tracking of users' online behavior, but also how users and non-users become part of kind of an abstracted economy of so-called data points, which is also taking into account the relations between the different interactions and the different ethical, political, and technological planes will be discussed more in detail by the participants. I'd like to actually thank Jussi Parikka and Ryan Bishop for the cooperation that they facilitate with the Transmediale through their institution, Winchester School of Art. And this panel that they, together with Greg Elmer and Ganaele Langlois, suggested for the Transmediale is also partly facilitated through that dialogue that we have on contents for the festival. And I'd like to thank Greg and Ganaele for bringing this to Transmediale. It's a very fitting topic for the festival theme. I'd like to mention that later here tonight there is also a screening connected to Greg's work on preempted politics. It's called Preempting Dissent, and this is going to be at 8:30, right? 8 at 8. Yes. Yes, also here, and there is not only the screening, it's a discussion also around that with Jussi again, and Oliver Leone Schultz, and of course Greg Elmer. So Jussi Parikka, to introduce him, he's not at all an unfamiliar face here at the Transmediale. I think we cooperated at least for the past, 2-3 years? Yeah, 4 years I think it's now, even though also before you were a regular speaker, I think, at the festival. He's a professor at the Winchester School of Art at the University of Southampton, and his research focuses on media archaeology, not only, but questions of media materiality, more lately media geology, with a special attention always to, I think, the dark sides of network cultures. His publications are numerous. They include Insect Media, Digital Contagions, What is Media Archaeology. Most recently, the small leaflet that you can also find here, hopefully there are still copies in the bookshop, The Anthro-Obscene. That's an essay that was first presented actually at the last year's Transmediale conference, and that's also part of this forthcoming book this year, A Geology of Media. So a warm welcome, give a hand to Jussi and the participants. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Christopher. I wasn't expecting that I'm going to be introduced in such a nice way. I thought that I'm going to be in just a more of a kind of a mediating referee role for this panel. But thank you, Christopher. Thank you, Transmediale. As said, we are very happy partners of the festival, have been for a couple of years. The Winchester School of Art has been happy to collaborate on so many ways and so many levels with the festival, and it's really contributing to our work as well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to welcome and introduce the panel briefly with a couple of words. The words are just going to be tagging along what already the organizers of the panel submitted. So I'm just going to give a context, after which we have our 4 speakers. We have 4 scholars who have contributed in most important ways to talking about the algorithmic logic, the techniques, but also the technologies of power in social media. Greg Elmer, Ganaele Langlois, and Helmond, and Carolin Gerlitz will offer insights to the way in which social media companies capture, use, and model social actions as data points. I'll give introductions to the individual speakers later. Just a couple of words in a way to connect what we already spoke about. As you noticed, some of the work of our panelists was featured yesterday already, for instance, in Tiziana's lovely keynote. So you kind of got an insight. I'm sure that you're already familiar with some of the work they have been doing. But also yesterday, Matteo Paschinelli proposed to think of mathematics as the new epistemology of power. something that is present in the capture of the anomalous, even in the capture of the anomalous. The importance of metadata for measuring and extracting network surplus value, something that social media corporate business models, in a way, work with. But also monitoring social tendencies and teaching the machines of management and logistics a more specific way of handling such data. So the idea that the artificial intelligence machine learning that some social media corporations are especially investing into now and perhaps moving into more from the kind of notions of archival and library to actually machine learning, artificial intelligence, that seems to be defining this culmination point in terms of different sort of a data point economy. So, but in terms of thinking about this, geometry, algebra, and mathematics, broadly speaking, they do have a long history, even if we can say that mathematics has a certain kind of role in as a kind of epistemology of power now, but of course it has a longer history in relation to constituting the modern world. And the modern way of understanding space, time, and subjectivity as data points, and or vectors that are derived from those points. So I'm thinking about the hundreds of years of colonial accountancy and geographical knowledge, to the emergence of office machines, statistics, and so forth, all of which have been instrumental techniques in this longer history of power that sort of connects also with what we will be talking about, sort of kind of early history of the social media things today. Furthermore, to talk of data points implicitly brings to mind the use of point, of course, in geometry. A unique location, at least when discussed in terms of Euclidean space, point that itself is without dimension but acts as an important node in the plotting of space as geometrics of space. The point marks the space in a similar manner as zero marks the mathematical space. To occupy the point to zero is to be identifiable in the grid or in relation to the point. As Brian Rotman has reminded in his fantastic work on the history of zero in mathematics, visual culture, and the media history of money, it is with such forms of notation that the relation of objects and signs, and we could add subjectivities, is reversed. So basically, historically, the emergence of zero, the gap that marks the relation between numbers, constitutes itself a system. It is the beginning of a system, a grid where objects gather their sense as numerical. The longer history of points and power then relates to such enumerated forms of power that, in Rotman's words, they mark what is real, what is graspable. So I'll use his words and quote, "The things that are ultimately real, that is numbers, visual scenes, and goods, are precisely what the system allows to be presented as such." And he continues, "The system becomes both the source of reality, it articulates what is real, and provides the means of describing this reality as if it were some domain external and prior to itself." And this is what Rotman talks about in terms of the media history of zero, the point as well. And we can actually quite easily substitute some of these words, and it starts to make sense, even if what we are going to be doing today is insisting on the much more specific analysis of the techniques and technologies of quantification, optimization, modeling, analytics, etc. So data points do not necessarily refer to only individuals as human beings, even if individuals are increasingly hailed as, Althusser might have it, also as data. But data points are also just devices, massively distributed in the world, the Internet of Things. Devices and data addresses, address space, becomes the vectors along which the so-called people become identifiable, nameable, both as possible targets in security operations, but also to mundane social media culture. These points and transactions are revealing. In a very recent news of MIT research, it revealed how consistently one can identify a person from anonymized data. They analyzed anonymous credit card transactions from over 1 million people, running it through their analytics. And even with minor metadata having to do with location time, they were able to identify most of the transactions to a person, about 90%. As the panel argues, it is not merely the users, but also the non-users that are targeted. It is a process of value creation itself, of becoming data point that aggregates points and patterns as profiles and shadow profiles. It's in this context that this panel seeks to question the ethical, political, technological implications of becoming a data point. Broadly construed, it seeks to rethink the predominant attention economy framework, and this is where our panelists will discuss the algorithmic and data-based work of social media companies, expanding their markets in that terrain where social relations meet the data point economy. So we have all 4 speakers. I think the order is going to be Greg, Elmer, and Helmond, Carolin, Gerlitz, and then Ganaele, Langlois. And I'll introduce the speakers just before the presentations, and we'll move on to Greg Elmer, who Greg Elmer is familiar to you from many publications. He's Professor of Media at Ryerson University in Toronto, and also Director of Infoscape Lab. He's an award-winning media producer and director, so he doesn't write only books. But his books on surveillance, politics, and new media have been published by prestigious publishers, MIT Press, Peter Lang, Arbeiter Ring Press, and as already mentioned, his work distributes across writing, but also directing. We're going to see later his film, Preempting Dissent, so more about that later. And relevant to the panel, it's good to mention that he's co-editor of the forthcoming volume, Compromised Data, From Social Media to Big Data, which is coming out with Bloomsbury Press. But I'm going to hand it over to Greg and your talk. A warm welcome, and warm welcome to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jussi, for that nice introduction. It's a bit of a sad start to my talk today. I feel it's important to recognize the passing of Professor Randy Martin from NYU, who was the chair, most recently the chair of the School of Art and Public Policy. Randy was a very, very generous scholar, mentor, and was very important for my own work with regards to issues of financialization, art, and politics. Thank you, Randy. Okay. On to today's topic after that sad moment. For the drive to capture all, of course, the reason that we're all here, the theme of the conference, the data point must proliferate. I think that's one of the first and most obvious points I want to make. It must proliferate, I think, not just to pick up on some of Jussi's remarks, not just in time, but also in space. The data point is also perhaps one of the most empirically based digital artifacts, if we can use that term. So the data point proliferates as quantifiable objects. And I'll be touching on, upon some of the issues that I think were raised very nicely by some of the speakers from yesterday's panels and keynotes. So as quantifiable objects, data points vastly reproduce the opportunities to calculate relationships. So in this sense, they are, in effect, I guess we could call them the raw materials for the modalities of algorithmic governance. So again, I think some of these points, I've kind of shifted spent the morning kind of redrawing my presentation a little bit to respond to some of the things that have been said over the last couple of days, over the last few panels. So I'd just like to spend the few minutes that I have during my talk this morning asking some questions and pointing out some new directions for reflection on this so-called drive to capture all. Again, in the very first instance, I would argue, through the data point. So, the 390 double-decker bus, a street sign pointing to Notting Hill and Bayswater, the address and the name of a home, a closed 300-year-old pub, the Guardian newspaper, happy 50th balloons, fish in a pond, a child, a second child, a third child, a mother, a father, a picture of an old man, a dog, a cat, a housekeeper, a nanny. These could very well be termed data points, all of these data points of which I interacted with, I think, last week in the Paddington area of London. I came across these data points as I was directing my new film called The Canadian Delegation. I had to slip that in, didn't I? So for the filmmaker, these data points are first discrete elements. They are captured as discrete elements, or, to use the language of filmmaking, they are cutaways, literally. They are fragments disaggregated from time and space. Yet once assembled, or perhaps reassembled, and juxtaposed against each other, and with other human subjects, they bring the story to life. And it is this storytelling that data points require, yet also necessarily hide. I would argue even more so than the so-called profile. In many respects, it's much more nimble than that kind of one term in and of itself. So my first point here, by way of an introduction through all these data points in Paddington, is to suggest that one thing that we haven't discussed perhaps as much over the last couple of days is the need for stories, the need to construct stories, to narrativize, if you will, to assemble data points into meaningful ways to govern, ways to criticize that algorithmic governance, excuse me. So one way of narrativizing data points is through, as many people have noted before, including Carolin yesterday, this notion of relationality or interrelationality. But before I get to that, before I get to the kind of the becoming data point of my talk this morning, I'd first like to just kind of perhaps lay out some more characteristics of the data point, and this will hopefully help to provide some infrastructure to our discussion this morning. In many respects, the data point is a known quantity. That is to say, that the data point precedes analytics. Perhaps this is almost, if I were to kind of reprogram this panel, I would have said we should have had the panel before the algorithm panel yesterday. The data point is abstract certainty to the extreme. It is the raw element of the known and knowing worlds, codified in relatively uncontroversial categories. Again, spatially and temporally indexed. For example, a point in the time of day and night, a point in temperature, a point in space, an altitude, latitude, GPS location, etc. A point on paper, a monetary unit, a discrete life, and so forth. So because data points assume an abstract fixity or knowable abstraction, they again presume and call for the search for relationality, a meaning for, or again, as Carolin was suggesting yesterday, a valuable relationality. So how does the user fit in this data point economy? Maybe let's come at it from another angle. Let me pose another question, perhaps. What's the business model? And Jussi alluded to this. What's the business model of data points and big data or social data analytics? if not the predominant model in which we talk about today, that is sales, advertising, marketing. What I want to suggest is is to kind of pull back and move and suggest a move away from understanding data points as an economy of attention to an economy of attribution. So this economy of attribution, however, is not or should not be restricted merely to assigning or, of course, attributing value or even searching for that value, though, of course, those are all key elements of that political economy of data points. Let me also say that another move I would like to suggest, in addition to moving to this economy of attribution, is a move away from, or perhaps in addition to some of the institutional frameworks, or perhaps metaphors that we have used very productively in the past: the school, the prison, the factory. I'd like to suggest another, this is kind of by way of conclusion because I only have a few more minutes left. I'd like to suggest another metaphor, or I'd like to suggest another diagram. Not necessarily an institution as such, but a practice of social and economic justice, or justification. And that is the practice of accounting. Specifically, as the practice of financial writing, or financialized writing, of not only attributing value to relationships amongst data points, but also rewriting the terms of economics itself, of income, of what income means, what salary means, profits, etc. And of course, the terms of political accountability itself. So perhaps just to wrap up, the study of data points through the lens of accounting provides a more explicitly political lens, in my opinion, one that helps to question and understand the language, the data language, the diagrammatic language of justification, and of course, the normalization of that social and economic lexicon. Thank you.